installment of the Chinese Business History webinar at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm Ghassan Moazin, an assistant professor here at the Institute. So today we're very glad and honored to welcome to the webinar series Dr. Cécile Armand. Dr. Armand is at the moment a postdoctoral researcher at École Normale Supérieure in Lyon. And I think she will be known to many of you if you've delved into business history. She has published quite a bit in business history, urban history, the history of advertising. And most recently, her new book came out with Dick Reuter, Madmen in Shanghai, A Social History of Advertising in Modern China, 1914 to 1956, which is also what she's going to talk to us about today. And I actually just learned that she is preparing yet another volume on advertising, so we can look forward to that as well. Before I hand things over to Dr. Armand, I should say that the format is as usual. Dr. Armand is going to talk for around 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them to the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out during the Q&A period, and Dr. Armand can get back to you about that. But Cécile, I don't want to take up any more of your time. So if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
Okay. So thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you to the organizer for inviting me. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to present my first book. And I want also to thank the audience. I can't see them, but I want to thank you all for being here today, especially those joining from Hong Kong, because I know it's getting late for you, so I really appreciate you taking the time. I will share my screen now. Can you see it? Yeah, I hope so.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, let me introduce. So this book is my first monograph. It is based on my doctoral research, which I conducted between 2012 and 2017 in France, under the co-supervision of Christian Henriot, who is professor at Aix-Marseille University, and Carole Benedict, who is professor at Georgetown University. And when I began my research, there was already a substantial body of work examining how advertising reflected or shaped consumer mindsets and broader cultural imaginaries in Chinese society. And this approach can be seen in works by scholars like Huang-Ke Wu, Barbara Mittler, Tani Barlow, or Weibin Tai. And while I found this study very inspiring, I was not entirely satisfied by the way they frame advertising essentially as a reflection or a distorting mirror of social reality. This perspective tends to overlook the fact that advertisements were primarily intended to sell products in response to commercial strategies. So the questions that were driving my curiosity at the time were the following. Where did these images come from? Who were the people and the historical actors behind them? What were they originally created for in response to what demands and strategies? So initially, I believed the answers to these questions would lie within company archives, especially the archives of advertising companies, where I expected to find marketing plans, consumer surveys, and other business documents that would offer insights into advertisers' intentions and mindsets. And while some studies have focused on the advertising strategies of large companies with dedicated departments, such as Sherman Cochrane's fascinating research on the British American Tobacco Company or pharmaceutical companies like the Wuzhou Yaofang, there has been no research specifically focused on advertising agencies. So unfortunately, I was unable to locate the archives of advertising agencies as I had hoped initially. These records seem to have been lost during the tumultuous years of the Sino-Japanese War, the Civil Wars, or the Communist Revolution. However, the materials I found in Shanghai municipal archives, as well as in newspapers, professional textbooks, and street photographs, partially addressed my original questions and also opened new unexpected avenues for exploration. So my talk today will be organized into three main sections, each reflecting one of the major questions driving my research and also corresponding to the three main parts of the book. The first key question is who? Who created the advertisements? Who were the first advertising professionals in modern China? How did they emerge as a new professional group, and what did their day-to-day work look like? So one of the major innovations of this period was the rise of professional advertising agencies. And the number of these agencies grew significantly during the Republic, with over 100 of such agencies operated in Shanghai, where most of them were headquartered. These independent agencies were distinct from the in-house departments of major companies like the British American Tobacco, studied extensively by Sherman Cochrane, which served only their parent companies and focused on specific products. By contrast, independent agencies worked for a variety of clients and often including competitors. These new agencies exhibited several key characteristics. First, they positioned themselves as experts on the Chinese market, dedicated to serving their clients and standing apart from what they called amateurs, brokers, or snipers. You know, these individuals who engaged in illegal bill posting on public walls or public buildings, or who persistently covered their competitors' posters. And to distinguish themselves from these amateurs, professional agency promoted scientific methods for campaign planning and market surveys. Like other emerging professions at the time, such as law, journalism, or medicine, these agencies claimed to work for the benefit of Chinese society and public welfare at large. And the new generation of self-proclaimed professionals often received their training abroad, particularly in journalism or commercial sciences, most often at American universities, which were at the forefront of training in these new fields. So in my book, I present several case studies on several of these agencies and their managers, representing different nationalities and different generations. So today, I would like to briefly introduce a few examples of such agencies. The earliest major advertising agency in Shanghai was established in 1914. It originated from the advertising department of a publishing company, the French Presse Orientale, founded in 1897. With an international outlook reflected in its staff, its board of directors, and its clientele, the agency operated in both print and outdoor advertising, particularly neon lights and streetcar advertisements, advertisement on tramway, for instance. However, the Oriental Agency faced serious challenges during the First World War, as the war affected its European clientele, and it increasingly struggled after the war with competition from a newly established independent agencies. And ultimately, it went bankrupt in 1930 and was acquired by the British agency Millington Limited, which I will introduce later. The second generation of advertising agency after the First World War was exemplified by the Carl Crow Incorporated and the Chinese Commercial Advertising Agency, Huashan Guanggao Gongsi, which you can see, on which you can see some advertisement here. These two agencies were the first in China to adopt an American modeled approach. They were founded by American, like Carl Crow, or American-trained professional, like Lin Zhenbin. Both agencies were active in press and outdoor advertising, and they developed extensive network of clients and collaborators across China and internationally. They worked with major brands like Coca-Cola, Pond's Cold Cream, Sun-Made Resin, or Ford Motor Company. Carl Crow was trained as a journalist at the University of Missouri, and he went to China in 1911 to establish several American newspapers with other journalists like Thomas Millard or John William Powell. During the First World War, Carl Crow worked for the Committee of Public Information, which functioned as an American propaganda office. And this experience, his news translation and placement during the war, was crucial in shaping his future career as an advertising manager. Lin Zhenbin, which you can see below, was among the first to receive specialized training in advertising at Columbia University and New York University, supported by a Boxer Indemnity Scholarship. After his return to China in 1922, he worked for the Commercial Press, a major Chinese publisher, before founding his own agencies in 1926. And this agency expanded to include branches in Hong Kong and offices in Taiwan and the United States. And these conditions facilitated his departure from mainland China during the Communist Revolution. In the 1960s, the company was passed on to his two sons and eventually merged with the American agency McCann Erickson. And this agency still operates today. It is based in Hong Kong, but the family is no longer involved. The third generation of agency is represented by Millington Limited, a British agencies, and the Lianhe Advertising Company, or Consolidated National Advertising Agency, which were established in 1927 and 1930, respectively. These two agencies exemplified the first media conglomerates in the regions. They employed nearly 100 employees, sometimes more. They covered a wide range of activities, and they maintained extensive networks, both within China and globally. They were committed to developing innovative techniques, marketing techniques, such as coupons, samples, or eye-catching devices in urban spaces. The Lianhe agency specifically controlled the advertising department of Shanghai, the large newspaper, the large Shanghai-based newspaper, and it managed the advertising account of the Commercial Press following the Sino-Japanese War of 1932. Its board of directors comprised a mix of different generations and profiles, including businessmen with no formal educations, press magnates like Zhang Jupin, which you can see at the top, and American educated professionals like Wang Yinbin, who was trained in journalism at the University of Missouri, like Yarkro, or Lou Mason, who studied advertising at Columbia University. Most of these agencies had disappeared by the time of the Communist Revolution, except for the Lianhe Company, which survived until the nationalization of the industry in 1956. So these examples reveal the diverse paths taken by pioneers who embodied different profiles of what historian Christopher Rhee calls cultural entrepreneurs. Unlike strictly regulated professions such as law and medicines, advertising had no single career path at the time. With unstandardized curricula and minimum state regulations, the advertising profession was more open and less formally structured. The second major question we can address is, what did they sell? And regarding this question, my argument is that this independent agency contributed to broaden the range of products advertised in Chinese media during the Republic by making advertising accessible to a wider range of companies. So what did they sell? In the second part of the book, I present a quantitative analysis of the products advertised in Shanghai, the large Chinese newspapers, from 1914 to 1949. And I also compare these findings with advertisements in foreign newspapers, such as the North China Daily News and outdoor advertising in the streets of Shanghai. And this study reveals several major patterns. First, there was a gradual diversification from the initial dominance of cigarettes and medicines to a wider range of consumer products, including cosmetics, hygiene items, food, and clothing. Second, new media strategies emerged. For example, cigarette companies initially focused on outdoor advertising, but they began to invest in newspaper advertisements in the 1920s, whereas pharmaceutical companies began to move outdoors. And some high-profile products, such as insurance or banking, favored newspapers over billboards because newspapers held a better reputation at the time. The third important pattern is that while large foreign advertisers advertise in the Chinese press, on the opposite, only a few Chinese companies advertise in foreign newspapers. And this asymmetry reflects distinct commercial strategies and distinct target audiences, but they also reflect probably language barriers that smaller advertisers faced when they couldn't afford translation services or the service from specialized advertising agency. And finally, in the face of rising competition, advertisers and agencies placed increasing emphasis on branding, brand names, aiming to build consumer awareness and to counterbalance the limited protection offered by existing trademark laws. Finally, how did they advertise? In the final section of my book, I argue that the agency profoundly reshaped the design, the style, and the content of advertisements. A substantial and growing body of technical literature emerged during the 1920s, dedicated to explaining the principle of effective advertising. And in the third part of my book, I analyze a series of textbooks written by professionals targeting students in newly funded business schools and advertising courses at a Chinese university. And these textbooks provide practical advice and theoretical foundation for creating advertisements. They establish three primary golden rules. The first golden rule is reduce text and increase the use of images and visual elements. And this marked a sharp departure from early medical advertisements, which were often cluttered with text, and also from newspapers' practices that indexed advertising costs based on the number of lines or the number of characters. The second principle is be pedagogical and use simple language. And this perspective aligned with the contemporary Baihua movement, which aimed to replace classical Chinese with a vernacular language accessible to a broader audience. This emphasis on imagery and simplicity served several purposes. First, it was to engage illiterate and less literate consumers. Second, it served to introduce new products and to explain their use more effectively through educational images. And third, it served to capture the attention of busy urban elites who had little time to read advertisements in newspaper or on the streets. The third major principle is to avoid exaggeration and to emphasize both rational arguments and emotional appeals. This principle reflected the influence of the truth in advertising movement, which began in the United States in the early 20th century, and it initially sought to eliminate misleading claims about miracle remedies. And by appealing to consumers' reason and emotions, advertisers aim to both build credibility among elite male consumers and to broaden their consumer base to include popular classes, women, and youth. And overall, advertisement in Shanghai and outdoor spaces increasingly applied this principle, while also demonstrating ingenuity in their execution. For example, they utilized the visual properties of the Chinese language, its multiple reading directions, or the newly introduced punctuation to capture consumers' attention at lower cost. And these creative strategies helped alleviate the high cost of printing sophisticated images and addressed paper or ink shortages during the war and the economic depression of the 1930s. So finally, through their practices and their theoretical literature, Chinese advertising professionals challenged and reshaped Western conception of the Chinese mass markets, particularly three main stereotypes prevalent in foreign literature until the 1920s and 1930s. The first stereotype, and the most common one in Western literature, typically portrayed the Chinese consumer as the coolie, who was both poor and illiterate. And Chinese professionals challenged this stereotype and the related assumption held by Western observers that widespread illiteracy among the Chinese population would reduce the effectiveness of commercial messages and mass consumption. These professionals believed that educational progress during the Republican era was raising the literacy levels of the Chinese people and would ultimately enhance their ability to read newspapers and to comprehend commercial messages. The second stereotype is the general lack of purchasing power among the Chinese population. Chinese business professionals at the time were optimistic that industrialization could improve the living standard of the Chinese people. And advertising was seen as part of this process, aimed at enhancing the comfort and the quality of life for ordinary people. For example, while foreigners like Carcrow discouraged the use of coupons and free samples in China because he feared that it would attract a large crowd of poor Chinese, Chinese agency like Lianhe established a specialized branch dedicated to this strategy, the coupon strategy, to introduce new products and to reach new consumer targets. But at the same time, they remain critical toward this ideal of reaching the entire population, especially lower rural masses, and they more often targeted or prioritized upper or middle urban elites as their primary targets. The last stereotype is cultural barrier, cultural difference. It centered around cultural barrier to consumptions and the understanding of commercial messages. For example, early foreign experts like Carcrow or Millington often emphasized cultural differences in color preferences between Chinese and Western consumers. However, Chinese professionals helped these cultural distinctions gradually fade. They made initial taboo color more acceptable in China, or they showed that such differences were less significant than foreigners assumed. And differences in taste, eating habits, and clothing styles also gradually diminished, particularly in treaty ports like Shanghai, where cinemas, restaurants, clubs, and fashion shops, alongside advertising, promoted new consumer habits such as drinking soda or eating resin. So I will, just to conclude this talk, just to let you know that I've written a second book, which serves as a sequel to Madmen in Shanghai. And this second book explores in more depth the transformative role of advertising in Chinese society. And specifically, it examines how the advertising industry reshaped urban spaces and the periodical press during the Republican period, with a particular focus on Shanghai. And so this book has already been published in French with Presse Universitaire de Provence, and it is expected to be published in English early 2025 with the Reuters, hopefully. And before I conclude this talk, I also want to briefly mention my companion digital platform, MadSpace, which you can find the link on the right. And you can find on this platform, you can find all the primary sources and the curated data I've used for this research, along with many additional resources which I have collected and constructed since my PhD. So everyone is welcome to consult this platform freely. So I will conclude my talk now. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cécile, for that wonderful talk and the wonderful introduction to your book. As I said at the beginning, we now have some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out for Dr. Armand to answer. Maybe you can start us off with a sort of, a kind of general question, but we sort of know from, of course, from the work of Sherman Cochrane and others that some businesses, particularly foreign businesses, had their own advertising departments or advertising departments that would do their advertisements themselves. So do you have any kind of idea how that, like if we look at the advertisements in Shenbao, for instance, by the 1920s and 1930s, were most of these coming out of advertising agencies, or was there also a substantial part that was still coming out of the well, I mean, I also know that Shanghai had its own advertising department as well. So if we look at these, let's say the advertisements in Shanghai, were most of these coming out of advertising agencies, out of the newspapers themselves, or from the actual businesses?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Actually, it's very difficult to answer because the advertisements are not signed. You don't know, and since I don't have access to the archives of the company, I have no clue. But we can guess. So obviously, the large advertising departments of large companies continue to exist in parallel to agencies. So we can imagine that the British American Tobacco Company was continuing to use its own departments. But from the archives I found in the Shanghai Municipal Archives, I have the list of accounts for instance, for Carl Company or for Lynch and Bean. So I know, for instance, that in the 1920s, advertisements by Coca-Cola were probably made by Carl and Lynch and Bean. And so this is the way we can guess, who was doing what, but it's very difficult to know precisely which agency was in charge of which advertisement. So this is a kind of puzzle. Though for the Lienhe agency, there is one specific, I don't know how to call him, an advertising artist perhaps, who was specifically dedicated to design advertisements for cigarettes, large Chinese cigarette companies. His name was Lu Sholuan, and he's one of the few who made his signature at the bottom of the advertisement. So you know that this advertisement was made by the Lienhe agency, for example. But otherwise, it's really difficult to know. But from my understanding, this Lienhe agency was doing most of the advertisement in the Shanghai starting in the 1930 until probably the Communist Revolution. So except for the big company, yeah, this is a difficult. I don't know if it answers your question.
Yeah, of course. No, I was just curious, basically. Let's see whether we have any questions. Not quite. Yeah, not quite yet. I was wondering, you actually already kind of well, you actually kind of already answered that, but you said that only Lianhe basically survives into the PRC because your book, the time period that you cover also covers the PRC period, but it seems you said that only Lianhe basically survives into the PRC period. So do you have any idea what happened to the other sort of maybe the more of the foreign advertising agencies and did advertising survive the nationalization of advertising companies? Or, I mean, what exactly happened with Lianhe after nationalization?
Yeah, that's also an enigma. Actually, it's more complicated. I said only Lianhe survived among the one I presented. But in fact, what happened is that in 1947, I think there was a new association created, or it was not a new association. It was I didn't talk about the association because I didn't have enough time. But an association was created, and all the agencies that were existing before the war were forced to register to these associations. So you can still find the Carlco and so on, but I guess they were not really operated yet. And then there was a major reform I think the first reform was in 1956, yes, and they merged. So all the existing companies were appropriated by 4 or 6 major companies, and Lienhe was one of them. And what it means is that each of the 6 persisting companies was in charge of a specific media. So Lienhe was in charge of newspapers. There was another agency in charge of outdoor advertising. There was another agency in charge of movies. And so there were 4 or 6 companies. And then there was another merging, and Lienhe disappeared. And there was just one agency for each major cities. So there was one in Beijing, one in Shanghai. And then what I understand is that also because, consumer products basically disappear and everything was nationalized. So I think that's really something that really interested me, but I have no means to follow this track, is that how the talents they developed for advertising and how the skills they developed for advertising was reconverted into this probably new propaganda, operation, and this new put in the service and the CCP. So that's something I can't answer, but I know that until the mid-1950s, these agencies were still operating, and probably most of their personnel was still active. and then they were reconverted to some kind of a party state, propaganda. So that's a question mark.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's very interesting, I think. We've got our first few questions. So the first question comes from Professor Parks Coble, and he says, could you elaborate on advertising by Japanese companies? Did they try to reach Chinese audiences?
Yeah, actually, I have very few. I know there were few advertising agencies in Shanghai, but unfortunately, I have little materials on that. I know especially that newspapers, Shanghai Manishi Shibun, and these newspapers were quite active, and I guess they were trying to target Chinese consumers. I know they were also active in the streets. In the Shanghai Municipal Archive, you find some application for like. Putting banner or flags in the street to advertise more like their military operation during the war, but they also try to advertise more consumer products in the streets. So I guess they were also expecting to target Chinese consumers. I remember this is something I developed in my second book. I remember they wanted to build an advertising clock. So a clock is very, very wonderful device for advertising because it's the middle of a crossroads. Everyone can see it, and they put advertisements around the clock so people can see it. And so, advertising was a way to compensate for the price of building this clock. So I have very little information, but I know that advertising Japanese agencies were active in Shanghai, though they were less important than American and British agencies or Chinese agencies, of course. So sorry for having so little clue to this question.
Oh, thank you. The next question, or the next two questions, come from Lily Mack, and she asked, firstly, do you see any major difference in the advertising scene in Shanghai and their counterparts in the US and the UK during the same period? And then secondly, also why Madmen in Shanghai for you? So why use the word Madmen in Shanghai for your book? What's the relevance?
For Madmen, it's a reference to the TV show, the Madmen TV show. So that's why I call the noon. It's also because it's you can play on the but there are some women in advertising. I didn't talk about that, but I found a few women, and I think they were more active than we assume in the profession. There were very aggressive business women in the field. So especially one who was based in Hong Kong and who was working for Millington. So perhaps the title is not appropriate because it doesn't do justice to the women invested in the business. But anyway, so this is basically a reference to the TV show. And the second question was about difference between American and Chinese advertising. I
think it's more about the advertising scene. So whether the advertising scene in Shanghai is different from, let's say, what was going on in the US and the UK at the time.
Okay, I found some interesting materials, especially in Karl Kroh papers and Karl Kroh's book, actually. He was devising campaign for an American client, for instance, and he said that these American clients wanted to basically just imported their advertisement for the Chinese audience, and he said, no, you can't. You need to adapt it to the Chinese audience. So what they say, for instance, that he was working for the Californian company Sun-Made Resins, and they wanted to sell resins to the Chinese, and they say, since the purchasing power was lower, we need to change the size of the package, for instance. So they compare an advertisement for an American basic family, for the housewife, an American housewife. It has the size of the breakfast cereal packets, but for Chinese, that's the size of the cigarette package. So they changed the advertisement this way, and they also changed the kind of imagery and the kind of message they address to Chinese consumer. So we have some indication of this. The way they try to translate. They also said that it was really important to translate the brand name properly if you want to address a Chinese audience. So you need to repackage the brand name. So the basic example I have in my book is for Coca-Cola. They engaged a Chinese person to translate, so it could sound well, Coca-Cola sounds like a poem, like a kind of alliteration, and also visually they say it was really nice to see for the eyes. So that's how they try to address different audience in different countries. But
yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, no, please go ahead. Sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Ni Yuning, one of our students actually, and he asks, could you please introduce more about what kind of commodities or industries were more interested in carrying out ad promotion?
So what kind of industry were? The sound is not very clear, sorry.
Sorry. Could you please introduce more about what kind of commodities or industries were more interested in carrying out ad promotion? So I guess the question is whether there is a tendency that whether some industries were more prone to use advertisements than others.
Okay. This is something I try to measure by this quantitative analysis of Shanghai. So it's based of Shanghai. That's what I say, is that you can find perhaps different types of advertisements in specialized magazines. But for a general newspaper like Shanghai, the more interested the more interested industry was cigarette and medicine, obviously. But then you have the emerging consumer goods like cosmetics, hygienic products, food products. There are fewer by Chinese industry, but there are some new food products they were targeting. And insurance company, financial products were quite interested. And the industries that were less invested in advertising were like a heavy industry. But I think that's also because this is not the kind of consumer they would find. People who reach Shanghai were, perhaps you have businessmen, but they are more interested in buying consumer goods than buying this kind of machinery or this kind of thing that they would probably be more interested to read in specialized journal for businessmen or industrialists. So basically, the major consumer of advertising were consumer goods, consumer industry, and they were expanding during this period. So that's why you have this diversification of a product advertised in newspaper.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Liz Emmerich Rouge, and she asked, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I just wondered a bit about your view on the intersection of photography or photojournalism with advertisements during this time.
Sorry, I couldn't understand the intersection between the
photography or photojournalism with advertisements.
Okay, you mean the use of photography in advertisements, or no, the use of it?
I think so. I think that.
Okay, actually, yeah. Actually, there are very few photographs in advertisements. The main reason is that it's very costly to produce, and also because of the quality of the photographs in newspaper. So it was really discouraged. I found a few examples of photographs like babies. They tried to put a photo of a baby because they thought, a cute baby would help sell the products, especially for women who would buy the product. But eventually it was such a low quality that they abandoned it. And most of the visual advertisements were using sketch or drawing, or sometimes very sophisticated drawing, but very few were using photograph. And so that's really, but if you rely on, I expect if you rely on women magazines or journals that were using higher quality paper and higher quality materials, you will find probably more photographs, but it's still very expensive. So it means that only an elite few advertisers could use this, could afford to use this kind of technology at the time. And so it was mostly text.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. Sorry. The next question comes from Chen Jinzhu, and the question is, well, I wonder what impressed you most about the Chinese advertising development. Maybe something quite different or special to you. I guess that's a very general question, but the question is just what impressed you most. What impressed you most about the development of Chinese advertising, or maybe anything particularly that you particularly found particularly revealing, or something like that?
The difference between development of advertising, like in France or in the United States, or
No. I think the question just asks whether there's anything that you found particularly interesting during your research on Chinese advertising.
could you please just repeat?
Sorry, I think it's a very general question. The question is just whether there's anything that particularly impressed you when researching Chinese advertising.
What interests me? Okay. Sorry, I couldn't. That's a long story. I think I can remember.
Yeah.
No, actually, because perhaps I started my master's degree working on photographs and images, and I found it was a very this kind of sources, visual sources and hybrid sources are quite challenging for historians. So I wanted to to try to use it and make them could they talk about Chinese society? And I thought this advertising material was really interesting, and especially as I said in the beginning, I thought there was a lot to do because we had a lot of studies about the cultural representation, but I really wanted to go behind the mirror, know who was making this advertisement. So I think that was my major motivation in choosing this topic, and also because I am a historian, I'm a social historian. That's how I define myself. So I like social history, so I wanted to know, who are these historical actors acting behind the scenes. So that's really.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Okay. I don't know whether are there any other questions? Then please, we still have time, so please submit them in the Q&A button. If I can, I'll ask another question. I hope it's not too much. But you mentioned in your talk, you said I think that the Lianhe advertising company almost controlled the advertisement department of Shenbao. So I just wonder whether you can talk a bit more about the relationship between newspapers on the one hand side and these advertising companies. Like, was there, I don't know, would there be, for what you suggest, for instance, that Lianhe was very close to Shenbao and that they did a lot of advertising for them, or is there some similar phenomenon with other newspapers? So I wonder whether you can talk a bit more about the relationship between newspapers and these advertising agencies that sort of sprung up.
Yeah, actually, that's also a black box because when you don't have the archives of the company. So what I understand from what I've read in the archives is that these agencies were trying to have contract with a newspaper and have not exclusivity contract, but have privileged connection with newspapers. So it was working very well in the beginning for foreign agencies because they were dominating the scene. But when you have these large Lianhe company, it was this. I think this Lianhe agency and others were really having a kind of monopoly of a different newspapers in Shanghai. So basically, this agency were fighting to get contract with the newspapers. And for instance, I know that the Lianhe agency, this guy Zhang Zhuping, he had market shares in the agencies too. So there were really close interest between these newspapers and also with the Xinwenbao, because Zhang Zhuping was controlling the Shenbao, Xinwenbao, and I think he acquired other newspapers. I don't remember exactly. So this was really a competition between this agency to have to be able to place the advertisement for their clients. But from the time when the Lianhe agency bought or took control of the advertising department of the Shenbao, I understand that there was no other option for other agencies to get into the newspapers. I know, for instance, that Min Jiabin was working more with the Xinwenbao. So the idea is really to have a privileged relationship between one agencies and one or several newspapers, and then try to keep control of this share you have in these newspapers. That's
right. Yeah, that's interesting.
That's why I talk about media conglomerate, because this kind of agency were really controlling. Millington was controlling the North China Daily News, or actually he was printing the newspapers because he has really large printing offices, and he was controlling he's controlling the production of this newspaper until it disappeared in 1952. So it helps. The guy was really was able to place his advertisement in the North China Daily News, which was something because it was one of the largest newspapers in China at the time, foreign newspaper at least. So I hope I can have more answer in the future if I found these archives, but for now we have to guess.
Yeah, as is always, as is often the case. Yeah, but this is very interesting. Yeah. All right. Unless there are any, it seems that there are no final questions. So I think what remains for me to do is to thank you very much, Cécile, for taking the time to give us such a wonderful talk and also to answer all our questions very, very patiently. I think we're all looking, well, first of all, we should all read your current book, of course, but we're also all looking forward to your second book that I think will complement it very well. So we're looking forward to that. And yeah, thank you very much. And also thank you to everyone who has tuned in. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you, everyone. Do not hesitate to write to me if you want. You have my email in the beginning of you can share with other people. If you have questions, don't hesitate.
All right, that's great. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.